Amusement parks have always been places of joy, excitement, and childhood memories. But what if these places, filled with laughter during the day, hide dark secrets when the sun goes down? What if the thrilling rides turn into nightmares and the innocent fun becomes something much more sinister? Today you will hear 3 terrifying stories about people who encountered horror in amusement parks. These are real stories, and after hearing them, you might think twice before riding that roller coaster again. Stay until the end, because each story will only get scarier. Ready? Let's begin. Jack, Mike, and Sarah were childhood friends. When they heard that their favorite amusement park, Sunny Days, was closing for good, they couldn't resist the temptation to visit one last time. The park was known for its classic rides and nostalgic charm. The trio had spent many summers there, and the idea of sneaking in, after hours for one final adventure, was too thrilling to pass up. Late one night, they climbed over the fence and made their way through the silent, empty park. Everything looked so different without the crowds, the sounds of laughter, and the smell of cotton candy. The air was thick with stillness, and an eerie feeling settled over them as they passed the darkened rides. They headed straight for the Ferris wheel, which stood at the center of the park like a giant, motionless sentinel. The ride had always been their favorite, offering the best view of the park from the top. Jack dared Mike and Sarah to climb into one of the carriages for one last spin. They reluctantly agreed, although something about the situation felt off. The air was unnaturally cold, and every step they took seemed to echo too loudly in the deserted park. But Jack, always the fearless leader, insisted it would be fun. Once they were all seated in the carriage, they noticed something strange. The old, rusted Ferris wheel began to creak and groan, as if it were coming to life. But the controls were unmanned, and there was no one else in the park. The wheel started moving slowly at first, then faster, lifting them higher into the sky. They exchanged nervous glances, wondering if they had somehow triggered the ride by accident. As they reached the top, the ride came to a sudden halt. The city lights flickered below them, and the park seemed miles away. That's when they heard a soft whisper carried by the wind. "You shouldn't be here." Rasera froze, her breath caught in her throat. Mike looked around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one in sight. Where the carriage lurched violently, the safety bar in front of them snapped open, and the 3 friends clung to the sides, desperately trying not to fall. The whispers grew louder, angrier, and the wind howled around them. Jack tried to stand, but the carriage swayed dangerously. "So we need to get down," he shouted, but the Ferris wheel seemed to have a mind of its own. In the distance, they saw shadows, moving figures with no faces, just dark silhouettes. The ride spun faster, and the voices in the wind became screams. The park's once familiar and comforting atmosphere was gone, replaced by something malevolent. The Ferris wheel kept spinning, faster and faster, until the world around them blurred into dark. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the twisted faces of the shadowy figures watching them from below. When they woke up, they were lying on the ground in the middle of the park, the Ferris wheel completely still. It was dawn, and the first rays of sunlight bathed the park in a soft glow. But something had changed. The park felt wrong, as if they had crossed a line they shouldn't have. Without saying a word, they got up and left, vowing never to return. But the whispers in the wind still followed them, even after they left the park. Emily and her boyfriend Daniel decided to spend their anniversary at an amusement park they'd never been to before. Silver Moon Park was known for its old-fashioned charm and classic rides. It was the perfect spot for a romantic evening. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the park, they made their way toward the roller coaster, the park's main attraction. The wooden coaster was a relic of the past, creaky and worn but still operational. Daniel, always the thrill seeker, convinced Emily to join him for a ride. They climbed into the front car, and the operator, an old man with a vacant look in his eyes, locked them in. The coaster began its slow ascent, the wooden tracks creaking beneath them. Emily felt a knot in her stomach. Something didn't feel right, but she brushed it off as pre-ride nerves. As they reached the top of the first drop, Emily glanced at Daniel, who gave her a reassuring smile. Just as the car was about to plummet down the track, the lights of the park flickered and went out. The entire park was plunged into darkness. The coaster, now speeding down the track, felt out of control. Emily screamed, gripping the safety bar with all her strength. Suddenly, the car came to a jarring stop, throwing them forward. The ride was suspended in the middle of the track, high above the ground. "What's happening?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel looked around, trying to spot any signs of movement, but the park was eerily silent. Then they heard a low, guttural sound like breathing, coming from somewhere in the darkness. The car began to sway slightly, as if something or someone was pushing it. "Daniel, we need to get out of here," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. He nodded, trying to unfasten the safety harness, but it wouldn't budge. The breathing grew louder, closer, and Emily felt cold air brush against her neck. She turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was no one. The darkness around them seemed to close in, suffocating and alive. Daniel finally managed to release the harness, and they scrambled out of the car, carefully making their way along the narrow track. Halfway down, the track began to shake violently. The sound of breathing was now accompanied by faint whispers, unintelligible but menacing. Emily felt a cold hand brush against her leg, and she almost lost her balance. "Keep moving," Daniel shouted, pulling her forward. They finally made it to the maintenance ladder and climbed down, hearts pounding. As they reached the ground, the lights flickered back on, and the park looked just as it had before. But something was wrong. The operator, the old man who had locked them into the ride, was gone. In his place stood a figure in a long, dark coat staring at them from a distance. Without waiting to find out who or what it was, they ran toward the exit. The figure didn't follow, but they could feel its eyes on them the entire time. As they reached the park gates, Daniel looked back one last time. The figure was still standing there, watching. They left the park and never spoke of that night again. But Emily often woke up in a cold sweat, hearing those same whispers, wondering if they would ever truly be free of what they encountered on that roller coaster. Olivia and her younger sister Sophie always loved amusement parks. When they heard that a new park had opened nearby, they decided to spend the whole day there. It was late summer, and the atmosphere promised to be magical. When they arrived at the park in the evening, they noticed there were few visitors, which only delighted them. No long lines. The first thing they went to was the old carousel standing in the center of the park. Olivia sat on one of the carved wooden horses and Sophie on an elephant. The music began to play, and the carousel slowly started spinning. The sisters laughed happily, but as the ride picked up speed, Olivia noticed something strange. The carousel's movement felt rougher, although the music was growing fainter, as if it were nearing its end. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker. The space around the sisters seemed to shrink. Olivia glanced at Sophie, who looked pale and frightened. "Something's wrong," Sophie whispered. Olivia called out for the ride operator, but no one answered. The carousel kept accelerating, and the shadows around them grew longer until they swallowed everything. Soon there was nothing left but darkness. Only the faint outlines of the animals they were sitting on cut through the gloom. Olivia, panicking, tried to dismount her horse, but her legs seemed glued to it. Her hands trembled with fear, and at that moment she heard a faint voice. Someone was whispering right behind her. "Leave your sister," the voice said. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sophie started screaming. Her small hands desperately tried to free themselves from the grip of shadowy figures that had suddenly appeared around her. Olivia, in a panic, tried to help, but she couldn't move. The voices grew louder. "Leave her, she won't make it." The carousel slowed down just as suddenly as it had sped up. The lights returned, and the sisters were back in the park. But something was wrong. There wasn't a single person around. The carousel had stopped, but the music continued playing, though twisted and sinister. Olivia and Sophie ran from the carousel toward the park's exit, but when they reached the gates, they found them locked. Their hearts pounded with fear. They began banging on the metal gates, calling for help, but the park remained silent. Suddenly, they heard a creak. Turning around, they saw the carousel begin to move again, though no one was riding it. As these stories show, even the happiest places can hold dark secrets. Sometimes, what seems like innocent fun can turn into a nightmare before you even realize it. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button and leave a comment below about the scariest amusement park ride you've ever been on. We'd love to hear your stories. And who knows, they might just become the next horror story on our channel. Stay tuned for more chills and thrills.